Martin, I think it's pretty clear that Honda's screwed the pooch here.
Stay tuned for that and more on this episode of Overtake Mode's Recharge.
On the brakes, Leclerc has that inside line. Perez goes off the track, cuts the chicane. Off goes Leclerc, through goes Hamilton. Unbelievable.
This is Recharge, Overtake Mode's mini pod recap, where we talk about what our model got right, what it got wrong, and what to look for at the next Grand Prix and for the rest of the F1 season. Today we're going to be talking about surprises and worries when it comes to team performance over the last couple of weeks of testing ahead of the Australian Grand Prix. Then we're going to check in with the model. How has it been updated? How is it going? And we'll then walk you through the top 10 predictions for the Australian GP pre getting all the data from qualifying and practice. And then finally, we will wrap things up with thoughts about what team we think is most likely to break the model that we have. All right, so let's start at the top. Nate, I'm wondering, based on your impressions of the last 2 weeks of testing in Bahrain, what do you see as a surprise? Was there any performance surprises that really stood out to you? And then also, what do you see as potentially worrying for some of the teams on the grid this year?
I have to be honest, I've been really surprised with Haas. First of all, Ferrari doesn't always have the best engine, so that's not Haas's doing, but they seem to have built a car around that engine that works pretty well and in the new regs. But, so did Alpine. But Alpine's a huge team. Haas is not. And so you get Komatsu just as showing, I think, his talent, doing more with less. He's gotten a solid driver lineup. Say what you will about Ocon and Behrman or whatever, but they're just solid. And if you give them a good car, they're going to do okay. And we'll see this in the rankings later. So that's my surprise. They don't have a history of being great. Alpine has won championships before. So that's my surprise. And then worries, I don't think these are going to be a surprise. I think Aston Martin and Williams are my worries. Aston Martin, I think it's pretty clear that Honda's screwed the pooch here. Like, they didn't put out an engine that is really very good or reliable. It says something that we don't know if it's fast, because we've had 20 laps or whatever in the last test. And I think this also brings into the equation unmotivated drivers. Stroll and Alonso, I think, are talented. Yes, I think Stroll is a talented driver, but I think Stroll and Alonso both, if they're not really feeling it, they're not going to kill themselves to get the that extra tenth. And remember, I said I worried Newey's over his head. I wonder. And then Williams, I think they just had too much work to do. I think Williams is not that far off from Haas in terms of the size of its organization. I think they will put out a good product eventually, a good car, but I think they just have too much work to do to catch up to where they're going to be competitive, because the rest of the field isn't static.
All of that makes a lot of sense to me. My observations are maybe a little bit less deep that way. I think for me, the big surprise or exciting thing to see was Lewis Hamilton on the practice start jump from like P11 to P1 in a matter of seconds. I mean, it is interesting, I think, especially when it comes to your model, which we'll talk about in just a moment, because what we're seeing with that is a gamble in terms of engine design, right? From my understanding is that the way they designed the electric side of the car, it is slightly lighter, less boost, but allows the car to spool up a lot faster than some of these other cars on the grid. But of course, what they're sacrificing then is race lap performance. They may get off the gates really quickly. The question is, can they hold on to that advantage as the race unfolds? And I don't know if they'll be able to, but it could make for a really exciting start, at least in Australia.
Yeah, and I think what you always worry about with Ferrari, at least this iteration of the team, is that they finish? Will all of a sudden all the reliability issues pop up right in the middle of the race? Leclerc will be P1 and Hamilton P2, and their engines will explode.
Yeah, definitely. It'll be exciting. And as far as worries go for me, it really is. I mean, I think it's exactly the same. I don't have anything different from your list. I think Aston Martin and Williams just stand out as really underperforming. I think one of the things that's hard, testing doesn't necessarily reveal who's really at the top of the grid, but what it does reveal is who's in a lot of trouble. And I think it's done that. And it's done that work. Okay, well, great. So let's talk about the model. How have things changed on your end, as much as you are willing and should share in terms of the back end changes? And then also we can start to walk through 10 through 1 in terms of what you've got predicted.
So since we last talked, I added in like an ensemble prediction where it runs on 5 different weightings of items, and then it runs them, and then it uses the one that has the back tested best variant. In addition, I put in like a simulation, and it runs 1,000 simulations of the race, and those together with include like elo ratings now for the drivers, so it's more dynamic.
What are ELO rate? Do you say ELO ratings?
Basically, it captures form best. So when Lando goes into a funk, his elo rating is going to kind of go down, and it's going to capture that funk, but it's also going to capture that high a little bit better. Whereas if I just have a driver rating that's static, it's going to change very little. So the elo rating helps get those dips and rises in form a little bit better. But going forward, the model does use data, and as we get more data, the weights that we use will change, but I don't plan on adding any big components anymore.
Great. Yeah, it sounds like we're at a point now where we have to see these new cars actually get on track. And I like the idea of ELO. I'm just going to think of it as the funk rating. So let me introduce your predictions for this weekend as they stand now. I've been pulling some aggregate data. I know you have some of this as well, but we've been talking behind the scenes about how do we measure the success of our model against other models that are out there. And you were saying before we started recording that there aren't a lot of non-betting outlets that do this kind of data aggregation or predictive modeling. Those that do, at least in my cursory research, tend to just actually pull that information from betting sites and then share them on their websites. So I think that's interesting. We're not going to mention any betting sites by name or direction because we're not ultimately interested in sports betting at all. As we've discussed, we're just interested in this as an intellectual and data exercise as F1 fans. But I do think it makes sense to almost think of the betting markets as our kind of index by which to compare your predictive models. All right, if we walk through the aggregate data across betting sites, at the bottom we have Lance Stroll, which seems to be a real surprise to me, with Alonso just above him. So that suggests some kind of weird way of viewing Aston Martin's testing performance. I'm not exactly sure where this is coming from. Then after that, we have Oscar Piastri, which to me seems a little depressed in terms of what his actual performance could be. Then we have Lewis Hamilton, which does not seem improbable that he'd be somewhere in the top 10, but not towards the very pointy end. Then Kimi Antonelli, then Lando Norris, then Max Verstappen in P3, Leclerc P2, and George Russell P1, who has kind of been the echo chamber's favorite for first place for some time. And I think there's a big question mark whether or not Mercedes has been sandbagging. It seems likely that they have been concealing the full performance, but we're about to find out. So Nate, that's what the betting markets are saying. What is our model saying from P10 to P1?
Our model has Nico Hulkenberg in 10. I do not agree with Lance Stroll in 10, but who knows if, Aston Martin fixed something and Honda fixed something, I think the Aston Martin could be really fast. I think they're going to do well once they fix stuff, but I don't think either of them are going to finish the race. Kimi Antonelli in 9, and if you're wondering why he's down there with Mercedes, our model kind of dings him on reliability an awful lot. And he's also a rookie, so like there's a low confidence on what he can do. We just don't have a lot of data, but he does have some DNFs and reliability issues and stuff like that mean he drops there. And then we have the Haas boys, Ocon and Behrman. No surprise there. The model really likes the Ferrari engine, so they're both predicted to score points. However, I do have Ocon, his range, like the 80% interval, he's down 16. He might get into the top 10, but it's very conceivable also he could be in the bottom 5. And then I got Hamilton, but he does have a 4% chance of winning according to our model, but he is predicted to be in the top 10. Lando Norris is at 5 and Piastri is at 4. I just don't think there's going to be a whole lot separating those two. Leclerc at 3rd and Russell in 2nd. Winning with a 46% chance of winning is Verstappen. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. You give Verstappen a decent car, he's got to be a favorite up there. I have Max Verstappen anywhere between 1st and 4th with a 90% chance of getting a podium. It's most likely going to be a Verstappen, Russell, Leclerc podium. All of them have over 50% chances. So there you go. Hulkenberg, Antonelli, Ocon, Behrman, Hamilton, Norris, Piastri, Leclerc, Russell, and Verstappen.
Cool. Yeah, this will be very exciting to see how this actually shakes out. I think that my sense, and we don't know how the betting markets arrive at their data, I'm sure there's some modeling that's similar to the work that you're doing, but I also feel fairly confident that some of those betting markets are based on what would just kind of be observational thoughts and speculation. And my guess would be the reason why Russell's coming out on top is those betting markets are very much heavily betting on the Mercedes engine being dialed down significantly. And they expect, based on Russell's attitudes and the interviews, I mean, the only time that Russell to me looked a little bit shaken during the testing weeks was seeing Hamilton take off from P11 and take the lead. McLaren's going to be interesting too, I think there. I mean, I don't disagree. If Verstappen doesn't win the race, I think your model is capturing something really important about Red Bull and Verstappen that suggests he's certainly going to be in the top three. I will be really shocked if he isn't, unless there's some unforeseen reliability issue. But I think McLaren, what I'm excited about as a McLaren fan, and particularly a Lando Norris fan, is what Lando shows up to race weekend on Australia. Is it the Lando at the end of the season? It's going to be really tight between the two of them. But it could be that Lando has that little bit of an edge if he shows up like he did at the end of last season. But Piastri, as everyone keeps saying, and I do think this is true, his ceiling is still quite high. As we wind down then, just the final segment here I wanted to touch on is, if you were to looking at your model now, and we can both say this, what do you think is the most likely thing to break the model? Like what kind of outlier would sort of defy what you're predicting, but at least at this point from your perch, maybe not surprise you entirely that it kind of broke out of the model predictions?
In order from most likely to break it to least likely, starts Alpine and Williams. You could go from anywhere. I'm still not convinced that we're not going to see a gigantic pileup at the start. Nobody's ever done this before in competition, right? And you get some nerves in there, and Lawson or Stroll doesn't get off the line right away, and then all of a sudden chaos. I think the starts. I'm going to be real nervous watching the starts. And then Alpine, they've been so bad recently that they predict lower than I think they'll actually get. Like, I have Gasly at 20th, and I don't believe for a second that he's going to finish 20th. Colapinto at 18, I can believe, but that could break it. And then Williams, I have them at 11th and 14th, Sainz and Albon, and I that might be generous, but maybe, we never know. Sainz and Albon are, I think, the strongest midfield lineup out there, and so good drivers matter a lot.
And that makes a lot of sense. I think, as you know, for my part, and it's a little bit based, it's not really based on the data so much, and I think it's because my sense is there isn't enough data entirely there, which is the new team on the grid. It does seem to me that Cadillac, at least as far as testing goes, looks much stronger than anyone was predicting. I think the line I keep hearing was, if Aston Martin was in the position of where Cadillac was, people would be saying, oh man, that's not so bad given that they have a new outfit. Instead, Aston Martin is nowhere, and you've got Cadillac actually looking, despite the fact that this is a new team, albeit it's a very experienced new team in terms of personnel. And so that might be what we're seeing a little bit, although we'll see. I mean, the car, by all accounts, is much more simplistic in terms of its aero design, and maybe that's not that surprising. So I do think long term, your model currently has them at the very bottom. I think that's quite likely an accurate picture of where they might finish at the end of the season. But I sort of wonder if the first couple of races, as Aston Martin tries to gain some footing, as Williams tries to further develop their car so that it realizes what I think could be its full potential, that Cadillac might get some surprise placements, at least in the midfield.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, definitely beaten Aston Martin and Williams. And I think there's something to be said about a simple car. Look at Racing Bulls last year. Simple, and Hadjar and Tsunoda, when he was in there, they did pretty well. Put Bottas and Perez in that car last year. Well,
true.
Could be something special. So I think that's absolutely the right way to do. I mean, I'm really impressed with Cadillac's, how they put things together. And
we'll be back here on the Recharge pod after the Australian GP with our first true post-race pod. And after that, that's what you can expect here. A lot less predictions, more sort of post-race analysis. We'll kind of check in to see how the model did against the betting markets and also just against our own sense of where things stand. We are all pretty excited here to see what happens. It's been a lot of talk about these new regulations. We're finally going to see, just how chaotic is that start going to be. I think you're absolutely right that it could be a bit of a bloodbath off the line.
Yeah. Yeah.